Lupe Fiasco frees himself from the major label world with his sixth album, DROGAS Light, although this is no low-budget production. While Fiasco may now be free from the concerns of Atlantic Records, DROGAS Light doesn't really let loose. In some ways, that isn't that surprising. In recent years, Fiasco has been more of a keen observer and critic of rap music, more than he's been an active participant in shaping it. On one hand, this has led to some intriguingly cerebral approaches to the genre, and on the other hand, Fiasco has at times found himself straitjacketed within these stylistic restrictions. The shadow of trap hangs heavy over the first half of the album, and while Fiasco does an excellent job of holding a mirror up to the current state of rap music and production, a mirror can only ever reflect its subject. As such, the first half of the album really just plays out as a highly polished, if somewhat cold and cynical, contemporary rap album. While the end product may be clever, the execution ultimately serves to mute some of Fiasco's more transgressive intentions, all of which would make for a satisfying enough record if the second half didn't so drastically break away from the mood set thus far, growing increasingly disconnected from the slick, aggressive style Fiasco establishes so well early on. Lupe Fiasco has always been fairly eclectic, but really, DROGAS Light goes beyond his previous playful manipulations of genre expectations. It says something about the effectiveness of the mood set in the first half, that cognitive dissonance sets in when we come to more straightforward pop offerings like Pick Up the Phone and Wild Child. At best, this comes across as somewhat unfocused and confused, and at worst, it's a cynical place to dump some more commercial offerings that undercut the album entirely. DROGAS Light is a polished record, which largely succeeds on a track-by-track basis. However, as an album, it has some issues with its execution, and in places suffers from a bit of an identity crisis.
I had to do some reading up on what Lupe Fiasco has been up to, since I've been pretty disconnected from his recording life and his sort of interventions into the hip-hop genre. I was initially very surprised to hear a trap album from him, particularly because he made the statement that DROGAS Light is a prelude to an album to come and is full of B-sides or things from the vaults. So when he said it was something from the vaults and then it was a trap album, I was like, that doesn't add up here. But, that's cool. I was surprised by the amount of collaborations on the album and the general focus in the first half, because it felt a lot less frantic than his previous efforts have. And I am not sure how I feel about that, because I do think that his slightly manic style of music making has lent itself to some refreshing interventions into the genre in the past. One of my favorite is a serious throwback from, early 2000s. It's the song Hello Goodbye. And I think the song is what Kid Cudi and Kanye grew on in Man on the Moon and My Beautiful Dark Twisted Fantasy. I think Lupe Fiasco was incredibly influential in, I guess, what we could characterize as the darker sides of hip-hop, the ones that discuss the states of depression and the misuse of drugs often experienced by hip-hop artists that I don't think are brought to light by a lot of the more popular top 40 tracks. And I was kind of expecting something like that on this album. I definitely hear that sort of self-awareness that is present on his earlier work within this, but it's often just shrouded in 808s and trap chopping. So I didn't hate it for sure. It was just unexpected.
It's been interesting watching him morph into this sort of more detached, critical eye. And listening to this, I feel like at least the first sort of 8 to 10 tracks are intended to be using sort of the trap sound in a critical way. But I think that trap is so innately basic that it's very hard to get over that and offer any kind of interesting criticism musically with these very raw materials that define this genre. So I think that the sort of genre restrictions that are at play here really limit his ability to kind of do what he does. He occupies a really important space, I think, because while other artists who are perhaps doing this music now more successfully and more commercially, Lupe Fiasco has really been able to occupy his own space inside of that by offering something far more reflective, which just isn't present in a lot of his contemporaries. But I don't think this is musically the right thing to communicate that.
Here's the thing. I very much understood his desire to create an album that displayed sort of the oppositional forces of trap style and then his own subversive subject matter that he often discusses. But I couldn't help but feel that there are other contemporary artists who do it better. Of course, I'm talking about like Kendrick Lamar, who has maintained an identity of politically active rapper, yet he can still like rap with the best of them and produce mainstream tracks with the best of them. And I don't think that artists like Kendrick Lamar have to sacrifice the style or the substance, whereas I did think that Lupe Fiasco, I felt that his lyrics were not as hard-hitting and snappy as they usually are. And I felt that, yeah, it's almost as if his edge had been dulled a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that the album has some real points that are highlights, but I think they're only really highlights in the context of the album, not in the context of the genre or the context of Lupe Fiasco.
Yes.
And I think for me, the ending of the album is really indicative of this, because you have this kind of complete departure from what has been quite an effective mood that's been set up until that point. And it just kind of blows away any goodwill that has been created over the course of this album for the sake of, some fairly forgettable pop tunes, very well produced and actually probably in their own right quite effective pop tunes.
Yeah, because I think Wild Child is great, but I agree with you, doesn't necessarily fit.
It doesn't fit on this album, and it's almost a throwback to the stuff he was doing, years ago. It's not anything particularly new, and it's not really anything fresh, especially in the context of an album that's trying very hard to respond to where this genre is at the moment.
This album release should have been yet another card in this beautiful card castle of challenging and intelligent hip-hop R&B, and the first half of the album absolutely is. So why do you think he included the second half of the album? Is it going to lead into another album as he has previously stated? I don't know.
It's a very listenable album, but it's not groundbreaking the way that you would expect it to be. And it's a shame, because inside of this hip-hop rap community, someone with Lupe Fiasco's perspective on things is a very fresh thing to have and a very necessary perspective to bring to the dialogue. But he's not really offering us that here. And it's hard to judge this album because I want it to be something that it's not. And on the face of it, it's polished, but it's all show. There's no real substance going on here.